brief introduction whilst we wait for us to join us. Radix Big Tent. That terribly clumsy name is a result of the merger between Radix, which is the think tank of the Radical Centre. By radical, we mean we're concerned with system change. By centre, we mean mainstream and pragmatic rather than politically centrist. And Radix work through webinars like this, through publishing papers, and through roundtables and discussions. We merged 2 years ago with Big Tent, which is a platform for people outside the political mainstream to discuss, and literally takes place, a festival that takes place in tents. Together, we aim to provide the opportunity for those who are perhaps not part of the Westminster bubble to discuss and influence public policy. So, thank you very much for all joining us. And one of the things we like to do is have interesting and provocative speakers, which is why we're so delighted that Dan is going to join us today. I'm going to let Vicky do proper introductions in just a moment. A couple of just housekeeping comments. As I say, please keep muted until we get on discussion. We will be recording this event, so if you don't wish your name to be recorded, now is the moment to choose some strange version of your name. Today's discussion, which is on intergenerational fairness, is based around Danny's new book, Seven Children, and you can buy it during the course of the talk or immediately afterwards with a discount code, which we'll be posting on the right-hand side. So please do take advantage of that. That will be 25% off, and I'm sure you'll be inspired. If you're tweeting about today's event, please use the tag at @radix_UK. And we have had some questions pre-submitted, and we will be going through those. But if you want to submit questions, please do use the chat to do so, or indeed if you just want to make comments about what you're hearing, we normally get quite a lively discussion going in the thread on the right hand side, so please do that. With that, I'm going to hand over to Vicky Pryce, one of Britain's leading economists, and we are delighted that she is also our chair of fellows, and Vicky is going to take it from here. Thank you, Vicky, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I have to just tell everybody that Ben is suffering from a very bad cold, and it is remarkable that he's actually managed to join us and to do the introduction as he has done. He's going to sort of disappear from the screen, is what he said he would, until the end, so that you don't necessarily see him suffering. But it's him who it's he who encouraged me to be involved with Radix in particular, and I'm delighted to be the chair of fellows. But also, one of my jobs has been to get interesting people to interview, and with Danny Dorling hasn't been that difficult at all in terms of sort of choosing somebody who has very interesting things to say. We also do have something in common. He tells me that the first person he met when he went to himself to St. Peter's at Oxford as a fellow, of course, or professor, or whatever it was that you were at that stage, was indeed my son, who helped him find his way around the college. Yes. So he couldn't refuse when I asked him to help with this today. So Danny, we're absolutely delighted to have you talk about your book, which I'm going to wave around, as I said I would, the extent to which you can see it, which is Seven Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation, which I found absolutely fascinating. I think one of the interesting things is that, we do talk a lot about inequality, but as the book explains sort of quite early on, what we don't know an awful lot about is what happens to people in the middle, not just those who are really deprived, that we hear about a lot, and those super rich, but really also how they compare with those in the middle, and whether those in the middle are really any better, and what the life choices of those children are. So Danny, I was hoping you'd just tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do it in this way, write about 7 children, and follow, or at least anticipate how they would grow since
Yeah.
they are all, I think, at this stage, 5 years old.
They're 5
Um,
or 6 years old now. 6 in my
five,
head.
they're
Yes.
6.
Yeah.
They're not 6. Yes. So, Danny, tell us a little bit about it. And we already have some pre-submitted questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Quite a lot there. So that's going to keep us occupied for the next hour.
That's great. 7 Children is a book about 7 typical children. If you had to find 7 children to represent the UK, how might you do it? What I decided to do was take the 14 million children who were alive in the year 2018. I divided them into 7 groups of 2 million according to how well off their parents were. And I picked the middle child of each 2 million. So I am ignoring the poorest 1 million children in the UK. These are the children who parents might go to food banks, who might be homeless and so on. I'm going to ignore those. And I'm ignoring the richest 1 million children in the UK out of 14 million. All I'll say about them is that their parents take a third of all income, leaving only 2/3 to the rest. And then the 7 children are taken from across the income scale. And the UK, you'll repeatedly hear, is the most unequal country in Europe. But we're almost immune to this. We hear it so often it doesn't mean anything to us. We also hear that 1 in 3 children live in poverty, but we become used to that. So the shock of 7 children is actually describing the lives, the money, the circumstances of the children, all born in the autumn of 2018, and their parents, and trying to make it human, trying to actually describe part of a day in the lives of people. Questions such as how do you clothe your children? How do you celebrate a birthday? Do you have a holiday? So sort of maybe spoil the book for you or not. Clearly, as you might expect, the children whose families have least are getting by on very, very little. But child number 1 is called Anna. Number 2 is Brandon. Number 3 is Candice. Number 4, the child in the middle, is David, the average child in the UK. And for many people, those 4 children, their lives would probably all look pretty poor. Certainly from the point of view of people who are better off in the country. Then you may be expecting, as we go up, that child's numbers 5, 6, and 7 will be quite affluent, but they're not. Emily, Freddie, and Gemma. Again, if you write a book, you don't want to kind of spoil and give it away, but Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop. They have a disposable income of roughly £25,000 a year each. That's after paying tax and after paying the mortgage. £50,000 is the amount of money they have. By disposable, that is money to buy food, clothes, everything else in life. And so our best off child, mum and dad run a corner shop. This is what extreme inequality means. That the greatest inequality we've had since the 30s and the greatest inequality in Europe, other than perhaps in Bulgaria, and also a country becoming poorer. So if you have a third of all income being used up by families who are better off, and I haven't even talked about people who don't have children, and who tend often to be better off than people with children, and you don't share it out well, and you have relatively low economic growth, then the situations in which children are living are often shocking when they are described in some detail from the point of view of families. So if I tell you that 30% to 35% of children have no holiday a year anymore, you might be shocked. But if you go through parents discussing the idea of, would you like a holiday? Do you need a holiday? What is a holiday? Is it a waste of time? It can be more hard hitting. At least 3 of these children, their parents are renting privately. They only have security of tenure for 2 months. One of them receives an eviction letter. they will find somewhere else to live, and the state, of course, would step in to house them, or at the extreme, put them into bed and breakfast, which, because these are not the most worst of children, doesn't happen to any of these. But I try to give a sense of the levels of anxiety amongst parents uh, when you don't have security of tenure, when you're having to budget all the time, and a sense which matters most to me of how the parents get on with each other. The poorest child only lives with mum. Uh, Dad is around but 700 miles away and doesn't live with them. But for many of the parents, you can see their relationships grating, and that affects the children uh, more than other things. And it'll be interesting in future when hopefully, we will become more equal. There are signs that we may be already. And so when, in decades to come, the children who have only just entered school now talk about their childhood and experiences, I suspect a lot of it will be about how fraught their parents were trying to get them through life. So it's a story about heartstrings and feelings.
But it's interesting, Danny, because I mean, you look at what's happened over the last few decades, and I think you have in your book, you say that the Nordic countries are the most equitable places to live in Europe. And they are today as equitable as we were in the 1960s. So what's gone wrong?
We were remarkably equal by the 1960s. Our last peak of inequality was 1918, and then almost every year, certainly every decade, we became dramatically more equal as a country. Initially, because we had to tax the very rich to pay for the First World War, but then agitation, women demanded to be treated as human was a huge thing. You have to remember that the most common occupation of women in 1918 was to be a servant. This wasn't a well-paid job, but then you're talking working in textile mills. So the improved position of women is crucial. Secondly, the trade unions getting wages up and so on. Then things like the fear of revolution. If we're going back to 1918, it made the rich behave better. Half of the equality that we gained in income was gained by 1939, and this is often forgotten. In the 20s and 30s, there was a big reduction in inequality. It was solidified by the 45 government, all political parties becoming more progressive, Conservatives building more council houses than Labour. A social and cultural change. To get to a point, and I often say this in the 1960s, where when a judge said to a jury about a book, is this a book you would like your wife and servants to read? The jury laughed and said yes. Now, that's Lady Chatterley's Lover. The change to go from 1920s, where that was banned, to the 60s, we became even more equal by the early 1970s. Cities like Sheffield had life expectancy higher than the average for England. You have to use the numbers, otherwise you can't believe some of these statistics. Sweden was slightly more equal than we were. Obviously, there were things which were not good. We could talk about still the position of women in the 70s, all about racism. It wasn't a utopia, but we had one of the most equitable schooling systems in the world. Certainly by the early 1970s was coming in, despite our very high private education proportion. We had one of the most successful social housing programs in the world, which was being copied by other places, the most successful health service in the world. We did that partly, I would suggest, unplanned. It wasn't entirely brilliant progressive politicians, although they were incredibly helpful. And across the political spectrum, Beveridge was a liberal. There were Tory ministers of health who were helpful, but it was a necessity. We were losing our empire. We were becoming poorer. We had to find a way of being somewhere in the world, and we became almost partly by mistake a much more equal society. And then there was a rebound against that. It caused a reaction. There were some people who absolutely hated this. They tended to come from the conservative side of politics. Often they had grandparents, grandfathers who ruled over large parts of countries that were part of our empire. They believed we were becoming the sick man of Europe. That was the phrase. They believed that our productivity was low because we were constraining the tall poppies. And we entered an experiment for trickle down in the 80s, which I think now you can say has failed. But we veered from an incredible swing to becoming one of the most equal countries in the world to becoming the most unequal country in Europe. So it's a roller coaster.
This is really interesting because Nick Webb is asking, so what did the other countries do then, which got them to be more equal during that period? Or they didn't do what we did?
They didn't. Well, they were all, but in 1918, almost every affluent country in the world was as unequal as us. They all had an aristocracy. They all had the top 1% taking a quarter of all income. Remarkably similar. We were quite early on in coming down from our height. We could kind of afford to because we were still very rich compared to other countries. So, the welfare state we could kind of afford to do because the sacrifice required of the rich was not as hard as in other places. Other countries copied us.
I see. They were late in the game, but they actually did it better than we did.
They were late. There's a few examples early. New Zealand introduced the welfare state before we did. The US was very late. It wasn't until after the Second World War that the US suddenly became much more equal. It treated the soldiers coming back from the Second World War as heroes, and we had full employment, but as civil rights and so on in the 60s. The other countries reacted more strongly in the 80s against the United States push for greater inequality. They worked harder to keep what they had gained. They didn't go along with Reagan as much as we went along with Reagan. But they all did become a little bit more unequal. Yeah.
But does this, just thinking, I mean, those children who were born, those imaginary children, but representing very much sort of what exists in each of those bits of the income bracket that you're talking about. They were born just before the pandemic, and of course there was Brexit. You do suggest that more recently, we have been a little bit sort of negligent because we had both Brexit and the pandemic, and therefore looking ahead for those children, what does it mean? I mean, is there any hope, or is it actually going to be worse? And really, one of the pre-asked questions was, the person who asked it said they were actually, quite sort of angry. That was Lynn Brown who sent something in. Should we take collective responsibility? Should we force something different now? And of course, lots of things that happen in the budget are relevant, and we'll talk about those in a minute as well. But so, what are you more pessimistic about the future than just looking at what happened in the past?
I'm optimistic. I'm I'm optimistic partly for a very pessimistic reason, in that I only have 11 graphs in the book. One is from the United Nations, where they showed a change in the last 7 years in all the countries they monitor in the world, which are mostly affluent countries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in most of those countries, they show falls in child poverty, sometimes big falls, a third in a lot of Eastern Europe, or falls in Korea. Incredible. It's a really good news story. Sadly, there are a few countries which have had a rise in child poverty. However, most of those have very low child poverty, like Iceland, but at the very top of the list is the United Kingdom. We have had the biggest rise in child poverty of every country the UN measured. This is December of last year. And when you have done so very badly, when your situation, it's quite hard. We could get worse, but it takes a lot of effort. At the extreme, it took Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister to end up in this situation. Or I'll give you a very nerdy statistical example. In 1977, Peter Townsend, a sociologist, suggested that government should intervene in 10 areas and help them, 10 of the poorest areas. The government that came in 1979 was going to have none of this and didn't intervene one iota. 5 of those areas actually became more average, just naturally, because if you pick the places at the extreme, there's often reasons why they're there, and they're hopefully often temporary. And the terrible, tragic recent history of the UK, which is everything coming together to be truly awful, it's quite hard to keep that going, hopefully. But it's possible. I can give you a nightmare scenario of,
Yeah.
Kemi and Nigel get together and sweep the board at an election and we become more unequal than the US. But you have to believe that the British people are lemmings for this to occur.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed that you're right about sort of things improving. But there is also another question, which is, what how do we respond to this, or is that going to happen like this, or are there specific measures that are needed? There are questions about, should we have universal basic income, for example, or how do we get people to ask for the benefits they should be asking for, like, for example, the pensions credit, which pensioners generally do not go for.
Yeah.
So do we have a system which is sort of inbuilt, sort of preventing some of those improvements to happen to people's ability to survive? We're not talking now about the poorest and poorest, but those are people who are, not at the bottom, but reasonably so.
Our problem is we did have some pretty universal systems. The book is only about children.
Yeah, I know, but the families are important.
The family's important,
that, and therefore, if they get the right benefits, or if even the grandparents, I think you've got a little bit there about intergenerational stuff.
So one example, I grew up in a pretty affluent household. I have a childhood memory of going with my mum and my brothers to the post office to collect the family credit, and everybody did this. You had to be unbelievably affluent. There was a tiny proportion of society who couldn't be bothered.
So it was completely acceptable that one should do that. That's what you're saying.
It was universal. It was also progressive. It was also collected by the mother, which was incredibly important. Once you take it away and say, if you earn over a certain much, you don't get child benefit, and then once you take it away from the third child, so we've gone backwards on this, but within the UK. In Scotland, they haven't. So we have a natural experiment. If you want to know what happens if you behave decently, which is the situation in Scotland, there, at a very brutal level, children are still getting taller, whereas in England they're getting shorter. The statistics have become very simple.
Indeed, I found that really interesting, how they sort of the younger children are stunted in terms of their growth by comparison to what was going on before. And of course, we are departing from other countries. So and you do have the examples of that, and that is appalling, because again, the children you're referring to are not the poorest. So the whole middle seems to be stunted, as far as I can tell.
It's the middle, and people do not realise that the average child, if you are middle class, when you look at the average child in Britain, they will look poor to you, even if officially they get a few pounds a week over the poverty line. It is absolutely meaningless, that amount of money in the difference. And it's that realization of, this is what happens. If you do this for long enough, if you tolerate the highest inequality, if you grind people down, we're still waiting to Vicky, we're touching whether we can get back to 2008 levels of real wages. I mean, this is the longest wage stagnation crisis.
It's not the only country, though, Danny, where this has happened. I mean, look at quite a lot of continental Europe has had the same. I mean, the US, one of the reasons probably why they voted for Trump is because of that as well.
Yes.
So in real terms, so it seems to be. So what I find that you don't really cover. Except when you talk about the super rich, but of course you're not supposed to be covering the experience of a very rich kid in this. It's this the fact that we've all been expecting for quite some time that knowledge workers or the worker was going to get a bigger share of the overall GDP, but in fact it seems to be it's capital and profits that are getting the bigger share. So the workers, in inverted commas, have suffered as a result. Is Does that worry you? And that has happened, of course, in the US. It's happened practically everywhere, possibly not
Well,
so much in Nordic countries.
it varies. So the US is the place which has done worse than us in some ways. Although, according to the UN, recently it hasn't gone as bad as quickly, but most people are worse off than they were 4 years ago. So you vote for Trump, and your average US family, Trump could come out today saying he's going to do sanctions because of fentanyl, and that works for people in the US because they know how much that drug is all over the US. So the US is in the book as the it could get worse kind of scenario. We could become like the US, where one in 13 mums in Baltimore experiences eviction a year. There's unbelievable statistics, but there have been many times in recent years when average wages in quite a lot of European countries have gone up with GDP, or occasionally a fraction above it. Or put it this way, if you take the Nordic countries, the 5 Nordic countries, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, there are now 5 countries in Europe which are slightly more equal than them by income, led by Belgium. So five countries that are more Nordic than the Nordics. There are another 5 which are within a whisker. And really importantly, those 5 include France and Germany. Now, people in France and Germany dislike it when I point this out, but there are 15 countries in Europe with the 5 Nordics in the middle that are equal. And on the edge, at the extreme, are Russia, the UK,
and
Turkey,
Bulgaria.
And Bulgaria and Hungary.
Well, I think what is really interesting about that, of course, it is that for a long time, the Brexiteers were saying we don't want a state-controlled or the intervention, that there is a welfare state that we can't afford of the type that we have in Europe. Is it the welfare state that does it? That goes back to what type of benefits should people be getting? Is more intervention from the state to ease out those differences? Is that the answer? If we can start moving towards, what type of solutions there may be?
Well, apart from Ireland and Switzerland, we have the lowest public spending in at least most of Western Europe. They're spending €1 billion extra a week, €1 billion extra on health in Germany. You can argue about the exact system. The rest of Europe has very, very few private schools. We spend a third of what we spend on secondary education on just 7% of children. People go, but that's private spending. But it's only possible because we do not tax the parents. And 1 in 10 people used private healthcare last year because the National Health Service will not fix your cataracts, your knees, and your hips in time. So we are seeing a dismantling of the welfare state here, whereas the state is larger as a proportion of GDP spent on public spending in almost all the rest of Europe. The 2 exceptions historically were Greece shortly after the junta and Spain after Franco. So it's only these countries teetering on the edge of not being democratic, which includes the UK in some ways, which have had public spending as low. It is right that our spending is now at a 70-year high, but it is still so much lower than France and Germany and the Netherlands, let alone Finland and Norway.
And our benefits levels seem to be very low by comparison to others. Our sickness benefits are low, even though the government is now trying to reduce that burden by whatever means. I don't know whether you think that that's going to make any big difference, but there is an interesting point about private schools. It has been asked also in the chat, and of course we do know that one of the policies has been to increase VAT or impose VAT on private schools. And there is a question from Peter Fisher Brown asking to what extent this policy is likely to have any positive impact on the quality of state schooling, which of course would mean that you get better results for those young kids of yours that you have talked about in the book.
Well, we've decreased our spending per child in state schooling. It's interesting about the Labour Party. Over it's a kind of opposite to a shibboleth with Labour. So Tony Blair took away assisted places. You know, people on the right of Labour are still willing to have a go at private schools, which is I always think politically interesting. Over Tony Blair got rid of assisted places. This government looks as if it definitely will impose VAT. Um, my view on this is that it's good to almost all countries keep a private school system. It tends to be very, very small, at 0.5% in some countries, but it's a good check. You want to get to a point, and it's absolutely possible to get to a point, and most other places Europe have got to a point where 97 to 99% of people choose to use the state system. And you keep private schools as your canary in the coal mine to tell you that the state system is working. We have this division, which, although it's only 7% of children, in a city like Oxford, it's 30% of children at 15. In London, it's 20 to 25%. In Bristol, it's 20%, where people are being educated completely separately. And these are the children of those with the most power. And it is a division which in some ways is similar to the division that Nelson Mandela talked about in the famous speech that he gave before the judge decided whether he was going to hang or not. And Nelson Mandela in that speech quoted spending per child in South Africa, whether you're a black or a white child. You know, dividing your children, it has terrible, terrible effects. So I'm in favour of the VAT, but put it another way. A brilliant Conservative minister decided to break ranks last summer. And towards the end of the summer, she stood up and stormed out and said, our schools are unsafe, 200 have to close, the roofs are unsafe. The really scary thing is that there was actually a debate in the Department of Education about whether to do this or not, right? But you know, bless her, she swore, I think, on telly, and we had 200 school buildings closed. Now, we have an enormous school estate in Britain. Because of the private schools, which tend to be large, we actually have more buildings per child, more space for education than in many other countries in Europe. And we have schools which cannot let children in because the roofs are unsafe. And now, if this was wartime, we know what we'd do about this.
Yeah.
Okay. Teachers. We have an enormous number of teachers and teaching assistants and caretakers and cleaners looking after the estate for 7% of children. And these aren't the 7% of children who desperately need more help because they're particularly slow, right? These children tend to have advantages. This is an incredibly inefficient way of educating your country, let alone the damage it does to a child, to give them the message that there's something about them where they're so special that they have to have more spent on them. It's a bad system.
I take your point, but I mean, we shouldn't fall into the lamp of Labour fallacy. So, in other words, the fact that there are people who are being employed in the private education sector doesn't necessarily mean you don't have people employed elsewhere. And it is a public good. I think this is what Robin Stafford, I think, is suggesting in his note in the chat, which requires more spending by the public sector. And a lot of that other spending is by private and individual spending their own money and not using schools that could be used for others. So there is that element. So we mustn't immediately assume that the teachers are all going to teach the 7% and ignoring the others. We just haven't been spending enough on the others. That could be an argument, which we should have been doing.
It's an argument, but it is only possible to spend so little on your children if so many of your decision makers are not having their own children affected by this. You know,
well, that could be the case, but the decision makers, of course, depends who you mean. I mean, the politicians right now would guess that in a large number of cases, the Labour Party, they have not been privately educated, but I may be wrong. But you're probably right. In the previous government, they were. But there is an interesting thing in your book, and I take your point entirely. Yeah. Interesting about the actual results. That, you know, the thing that should really make us think again about the private sector is that those from the state schools that go to university, as you've got in the book, do better than the privately educated kids. And it's a bit of a of a myth
Oh,
to assume, that
oh,
those who
yes,
come out of there are better, are likely to do better in the end.
yeah. I mean, these things are fascinating, and also there are lots of signs of kind of progress over time,
Hmm.
because when you can go through why this now, in a way, it's an unfair comparison because from a state school in a poor area, it may be the case that only 5% of people go to university, but those 5% will be the unusual 1 in 20 of their school. One thing that's happened as inequality has risen and risen and risen is the best of 10% have worked harder and harder to try and get their children into the best of 10%, because the best of 10% are taking 40% of everything. It's hard
Hmm.
to imagine your child. Half of the best of 10% send their children private, the other half pay for a house in an area with a very good comprehensive. Um, Now, one thing that happens is that those private schools, which used in the 1970s, send a third of children to university, a third of boys into the city, and another third to Sandhurst and the Guards, they all have to go to university now. So if you send the everybody to university, it's hardly surprising that they don't do as well on average because it's universal for children from certain private schools to all go, that they don't do as well as average as the
Mm.
small proportion from state schools. Our universities are mixing pots. We now have 65% of young people by age 30 going to university. It was one unintended consequence of
Well, the majority will be from state schools, obviously.
the majority will be from state schools.
And
Uh,
so we should be able to tell generally what they achieve, and how well they do. Do we?
yes.
I mean, so do they do better? So it's not just a few who go and do better than the private school ones, but so do they do better overall?
They do better overall, and historically the issue is always Oxford and Cambridge, where private school children
Oh,
used
yeah,
to do
okay,
better, but don't anymore. So
interesting.
it used to be the case that if you'd had an education at Eton and you walk into Oxford, it doesn't shock you to walk into Oxford and then you do well. But that has even gone. Um, it the outcomes. So this is okay, and this really I think is quite interesting. If you take somebody like me, born in 1968, if I had gone to the local private school, which by the way is Magdalen College School, I would have been 20 times more likely to go to university than if I go to the next door comprehensive. It was certainly worth paying money to send a child like me to Magdalen. You increase my chances if university is your aim, 20-fold. Nowadays, the increase in chances is minimal. If you go to the local comprehensive, 50% go to university. Okay, more
Mm.
from Magdalen. The majority will go to a Russell Group university like Manchester and Leeds from both schools. So the question is, what are you paying your money for? And I think if people were to step back in the UK, particularly the richest families, and ask themselves, what are you paying the money for? It's often it's an historical memory of the huge and social advantage it would give you in the past. And this may have an effect. But in a really divided society, people become afraid of each other and live parallel lives. There are often fears that of who your children might meet, who they might
Mm.
socialize with, boyfriends and girlfriends. There are unfounded fears of drugs because drug use is highest amongst richest families because you need money. But it it's a very if you can step back and be dispassionate about the UK, it is an odd place compared to nowhere's a utopia, but nowhere else in Europe has quite this kind of paranoia about what happens to children and what they do, because inequality makes you paranoid and it results in really low social mobility. Because if you are well off, it's very hard to contemplate your children having an average lifestyle, particularly when you read a book like mine and discover what the life of the average child in the UK entails. And if that's the future of your grandchildren, you know, most people will try very hard if they're in the top 10% to avoid their grandchildren having an average life. What we need to do is become a more normal country
Yeah.
in which this is no longer a fear because we need our grandchildren to be able to mix and love and meet and be with who they want, which sounds a bit hippie in the 1960s, but we had this in the 1960s. We had a mixing that was possible because the differences between people's incomes and wealth was much, much less than it is today.
There is something in the book which also suggests that actually the existence of extremely rich people in the UK, which is nothing like what we've got in the US,
Yeah.
actually does affect all this quite significantly, because I think you hinted earlier as well about influencing more,
Mm.
funding think tanks, funding newspapers. Do you think that this is something that can change? I mean, given what's going on with the Guardian, the Observer right now, just to bring it
Mm.
in a bit more to what's going on at present, in terms of the influence that the rich have. Do you think that this is different between here and other countries? And the really reason why I'm asking this is because actually, in quite a lot of countries that we think are not non-corrupt or whatever, there is actually in the middle, in sort of Northern Europe, very close links between business and government. And
Yeah.
actually, they do influence quite a lot of what happens. Nevertheless, what we see is more equal societies, despite that. So how do
Yeah.
you explain what's going on here by comparison to elsewhere?
I, it's a question. Why is the UK so odd? And my
Yeah.
very
Why
short-term
is it
answer.
so odd?
Why?
Yes.
I think if you were the richest place on the world 100 years ago, and you were the centre of the largest empire the world's ever known, there is a very long hangover to that of getting out of it. And so you have families owning the Daily Mail, who, when they own the Daily Mail, when granddad or great granddad owned the Daily Mail, this was the paper of the richest place on earth. So those kind of attitudes and arrogance um, goes with this. There is certainly what an outside observer would say is corruption in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I think, kind of a more quiet deal, even in the most equitable of Nordic countries. What they don't touch is wealth inequality. They have high wealth inequalities, and the quiet deal goes like this, which is you in big business and in the rich families won't try and turn things around so that you don't have a well-functioning state and relatively low income inequality. And we, the government, we, the Social Democrats, we on the left, we won't take your wealth. So that if it all goes wrong, you can sell your house in the middle of Helsinki or Oslo and run
Mm.
off, right? Your wealth is safe, but you will not try to control the newspapers and the media and create a mini United
I
States
see.
in our
So,
Nordic
so,
country.
so for
Yeah.
us to move in that direction, I mean, for example, there was a question earlier as well about in the chat about CGT and wealth taxes and so on. So for that to really work in the UK, you need to at least have a system where the influence isn't so great by those people with the extreme wealth. But you can't change the structure of the UK society overnight. So
No.
does that mean that you're actually restricted in terms of what you can do in terms of redistributing that wealth?
Well, it will change. All societies do change over time. Our problem in the UK is we don't have many models of former empires, and they're generally not good. There's the Ottoman
Mm,
Empire in Istanbul. There's the Soviet Empire with Moscow left as,
mm.
uh, uh, places that used to run empires don't tend to have a great immediate. Later on, fine, but we don't have many. And statistically, this is meaningless because we don't have enough sample.
Yeah.
Um,
So we have to
we
wait.
need well, we can do things. We certainly shouldn't become a haven for pirates worldwide. Butler to the world, as it's been called. The
Yeah.
favoured place for international billionaires to hide their wealth, a kind of a Channel Island, but writ large in. That's just dangerous. That's we're consigning ourselves to become servants of the super rich in this kind of hope that trickle down from the world's billionaires. Um, so, but you need to be careful about how you do it because what you're not attempting to do is we. Sorry, I'm putting this badly. There's a danger on the side of politics, which I am, which is the left, of not understanding that the most equal societies there's ever been in the world, these Nordic countries, actually do have relatively high wealth inequalities. But you do things, which you do in Scotland.
Yeah.
You're allowed to own land, but people have a right to walk across it. Okay, you still own it. They have a right. Um, it the idea of suddenly introducing really high wealth taxes is unlikely to get you what you want. I'm in favour of greater wealth taxes and doing it carefully, but it doesn't. It's okay to have a few people with higher wealth as long as they're not disproportionately influencing your government, your newspapers, and they're
Yes.
fitting in as well.
But
And
you do
this
tax
is
them highly, and they do tax them more highly in those Nordic countries, actually, than
you do tax them highly, and they're choosing to be there because the kind of
it
rich
is.
you want the
Yeah.
rich well, I always call it ABBA in terms of music, right? And ABBA chose to live in Sweden. You want the cleverer rich people who realize they're going to have happier lives, and those rich people who hate taxation, you're better off if they just leave. You're better off not having them in your country. They are a curse
Mm.
and a parasite. And I would treat the very rich like this. There was a continuation and a difference in behavior of people who haven't almost always inherited. And there were some extremely nice rich people. Beveridge was one of these. So was Tawny. Uh, if you look at so was Tony Benn.
Mm.
It's and there are some quite destructive people, but money
Beca-
gives you such enormous
Yeah,
power. Yeah.
indeed. So there are uh, many other
Mm.
questions here, but if we can get back to some of the obsessions that there are right now by the Labour government, since you mentioned your left leanings,
Yeah.
in terms of the in terms of the disabled, and the incapacity benefits that I mentioned earlier, reform of this. Do you think that the question was from Alex Bradley, that there was a problem during the Tory rule, if you want to call it that people, disadvantaged or disabled people, were disadvantaged by the system, and are they likely to continue to be so because they expect the benefits are not very high, as we said, and B, there is now the pressure to get back to work, if you like,
Yeah.
for loads, and the money is suddenly looked at as a real burden to the state, which is an issue. So yes, although we have moved in terms of the type of government we have we moved enough, or is it more a continuation of conservative policies that we're seeing?
We're seeing a continuation of, if you like, John Major style conservative policies, or even to the
Mhm.
right of John Major, um, which is a blessing concern to where we had got to with the Conservative Party, which wasn't normal European conservatism at all. It was night watchman state kind of fantasies about what you could do. We were playing out, and fascinatingly, the international money market said, "Don't go there." At which point, you really shouldn't. But we've made ourselves sick as a country. We have higher levels of illness because of what we've actually done to people, and this is going to be quite hard uh, to deal with. And of course, we have uh, treated some people so badly in terms of telling them that they're not disabled, and then they have to go to tribunal and eventually show that they are. That we've created a level of fear and a misunderstanding, uh, and we have an enormous number of people in work. We have most of our university students are currently working. They're doing jobs at the same time. Many people are doing 2 or 3 jobs. These jobs are often not being done very well because people are exhausted and tired out by doing them. In countries which are more efficient, people don't necessarily work as much as long hours, but they're far more productive when they do work. There's this idea of getting more people to work means we don't think about the quality of work which is done.
Yeah.
My favorite example of this was getting a coffee in Japan. If you get a coffee in Japan, you often get it from a machine, but the quality is just as good as some person in their early 20s made to stand there with a hissing thing so that you pay £5. It's a waste of human life, making people do a series of jobs that we do make them do. And in more equal countries, or another example, it's really hard to get a pizza at 10 o'clock at night in Helsinki because people have a choice and they decide they don't want to work serving pizzas at 10 o'clock at night in Helsinki. Now, you may say, oh, that's terrible. I want the right to buy, but you don't want. Or in Oxford, if I go and buy a pint now in a pub in Oxford tonight, I am very likely to be served by a teacher, probably a secondary school teacher, doing it as their second job while working full time in a secondary school during the day. We shouldn't be celebrating this level of hours of people working.
Well, I mean, what we really mean is that we should be paying them a decent wage in schools, and we also should be paying decent wages for those who pour our coffee.
Yeah, and to
So
deal
rather
with
than eliminating that choice, which people have. And do you remember working as a room service telephonist in the Mayfair Hotel to supplement my income when I first got here? So yeah, I see your point, but I mean, what people would say is that this is precisely what everyone is going to do, or the firms are going to do with the national insurance contributions increase, and just substitute people who serve coffee with robots. So Elon Musk's automated delivery systems for the pizza you've ordered from some faraway place. I don't know. So I think there is a lot to be thought about in which way we move, but paying people fairly for what they do is, of course, a really important one. Now, there are a couple of questions before we finish in relation to again what happens elsewhere. I think there is quite a lot of fascination from learning from others. So Dennis McShane has written about this, but also someone else was talking about Germany as well. I think Dennis has lived in Switzerland, and then there was, if I can only find the right question, about the whole funding system in Germany. So what we've got in terms of healthcare and everything else, there are huge differences across. So the question is, can we learn from those experiences as well? Because we tend to just, tax across a variety of areas, and then use that as we wish, sometimes for the health of the nation, sometimes just to pay back interest on our debt rather than specifically to improve other things. So I was just wondering what you think about that.
We could do.
I haven't found who it was who asked about Germany, but I will find it, and I will tell them that I did at least try and raise that issue. Okay, that must be the last round we do, because I think Ben is going to appear any minute now and tell me to. No, it was Peter Brown.
I'll be Brown. Yeah, it isn't necessarily simple doing these international comparisons, and each country has a different system about how they do deliver health. But we've had a tendency to look at the United States for policy and not look to this amazing plethora of European countries with different policies. And everything from schools to housing systems to health systems, you have a series of different experiments working, and it makes much more sense to learn from nearby than simply to take the American model, which in many ways has failed, but at a very, very simple level. The latest data was released last week from the child mortality monitoring. Children in absolute numbers have been dying at a higher rate last year than the year before than the year before. This is a failure. And when you have a situation where things are going as badly wrong as we have, the arrogance that we so often talk about creating an idea of doing something out of the blue, as if there wasn't a continent there with better results than us in almost every measure. There are only about 5 countries in Eastern Europe, with higher neonatal mortality than we have. We are now a peripheral poor European country, behaving as if we were on top of the world, and we've got to get out of that way of thinking.
Yes. I mean, of course, Brexit and so on springs to mind sort of immediately, but there has to also be some different way, possibly even for the health service, with more direct paying of insurance for health and so on, which has been suggested also in the chat, in order not to have the problems that we've had recently. So we should really try and finish with a sort of note of optimism. You did already express it. For your 7 children, how do you think the sort of distribution, if you like, will be as they grow up? I mean, but do you assume that they're all going to go to university or not?
I assume that 4 of the 7 will go, but
that's not a very big percentage. But yeah,
well, it's the majority. I think 4 of the 7 will go, but probably the one who earns the most will be not going to university. I think their future is likely to be like my grandfather. My grandfather was born in 1916. Every decade of his life, things got better. He was lucky. He was too young to be unemployed in the 30s. He did have to go and fight in a war. He, as a young adult, saw full employment. He could start a house, he could get a mortgage, he could start a family. Towards the end of his life, the Labour government in 1997 had come in and they spent more money on healthcare. So he saw the most amazing healthcare in his old age. A child born in 1916, like my grandfather, had an experience almost unbelievable of quality of life getting better for his whole life. He was very lucky in a way. I am hopeful that our 7 children, because of how badly they start off, will actually get to meet more in future, and their children will, because we're in such an extreme example. It is hard to imagine it getting worse, but you can do the nightmare scenarios where it does get worse. You can imagine this government disappointing as much as the Democrats did in America. You can imagine us voting in an extreme right-wing government, and that situation, I think, for our children will be terrible, because at that point they're simply going to be lied to and told that the great leader is in charge and Britain is going to be great again.
But in terms of your 7, but in terms of your 7 children, if I may, Ben, before you come back, there is a question about, how do they rise from going to university, possibly getting a job, to carry on through their lives the way your grandfather did. They need training. And one of the questions has been from Dennis McShane, how can we force employers to do more training? Is that part? I haven't seen any evidence of Labour sort of saying anything very much on this for the moment. But is that an essential ingredient to that movement through the ranks, if you like, of your income bracket you find yourself in when you're born?
We're going to have to learn and learn and learn again, partly because we are a de-skilled nation in general. So in Britain, students are very likely to say that they can code and they can computer program, but when you actually ask them to, they can't, even though they've been on a course and can write it down. Whereas university students from mainland Europe are often much more practically taught and really can do something like do computer programming. So we've had an arrogance in our university system of teaching people to lead and have character ability to lead. Take our engineers. I'll leave you to this. A colleague called Gunter used to run the BMW factory here in Oxford. And Gunter really wanted to get some of the engineers from the university to come and help at the BMW factory. Turned out the way we teach engineering doesn't mean that you're much use running one of the most modern robot-controlled electric car making factories in Europe, right? So we still have an empire-style system of teaching people leadership skills where we don't actually have an empire to run anymore. And so this education is going to have to be throughout life, because you need to actually be able to do stuff yourself and not tell somebody else to do it. And that's going to be the shock for Britain.
Thank you, Danny. Ben is there now, and he's probably been trying to tell me off from the distance for a while now. So I think that was great. There is so much more to discuss. There could be so much more to discuss. And of course, we all want to know how all these children end up. And it's interesting that a number of them will go to university, and the one who won't will be the richest. I think that's those who won't will be the richest. That's really interesting. Yeah. One of them, at least. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Ben. Over to you. And I haven't been able to get to all the questions, but I got to most of them. And it's been incredibly useful that everybody had sent me questions on that beforehand as well. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, both of you. I think we've just not even scratched the surface. I'm very struck by Jess's comment right at the end that unless you talk about incoming climate impacts, then much of this discussion about inequality and intergenerational unfairness is probably not relevant. So that's for our next discussion. But thank you. You've obviously generated one of the best discussions we've had in our chat going on, and people are very, very engaged with that. Look, if you want to say thank you to Vicky and Danny, then you can buy not just Danny's book, which you can see with the 25% discount in the chat, but also Vicky's latest book, also Women versus Capitalism, and do take advantage of those special discounts for tonight. If you want to say thank you to Radix and Big Tent, we don't charge for any of our events. But we are a charity, and so we rely on donations from people like you. If you've had a good night, well, we're cheaper than going to the cinema, and so half of your cinema ticket, if you'd like to donate to us, you'll find the chat in the link in the chat to make a donation to say thank you for tonight. And that enables us to do more of these events. And we have our final webinar of the year on the 5th of December. So we've heard from a speaker self-declared from the left tonight. We're a cross-party independent think tank. So our next session is on democratic integrity. And we'll be looking at the pledges that the government made in their manifesto and how we hold them to account. And we'll be doing that in partnership with Unlock Democracy, with Tom Brake, who is the former Deputy Leader of the House of Commons, a Liberal Democrat, with Caroline Slowcock, who is former civil servant working under Margaret Thatcher and then under John Major. So we're covering the full range, and that should be really interesting. They will be launching a democratic integrity white paper. So that's on the 5th of December. You can register straight after this at radixuk.org. And finally, just to say thank you to all of you. The quality of these sessions depend on the quality of people who join us. So thank you for making it such a stimulating conversation. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. And
Good
Ben.
night. Thanks so much. Thanks
Bye.
both. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Danny.
Bye. Talk soon.